we make promises. And that is where this ritual begins, with promise. Now, promise has two meanings. Who here, I'm just curious because I know we have some children with us this morning. Who here has made a promise? Anyone? Adults, children, anybody made a promise? Come on, everybody, at some point, right? You're human, right? So we made promises. And sometimes a promise is like, I promise you that I will not eat your dessert while you go to the bathroom, right? That's a promise. We also might make the promise to somebody, say, Mom, I'll clean my room after the movie. I promise. And that's a commitment, right? And then we, as a community, make a promise every time we gather together like this for one of these services. Our covenant is a promise. It's what binds us together. Here at All Souls, we do not ask anybody to believe a certain orthodoxy or dogma or doctrine or any set of beliefs. We give everybody the freedom to follow their own conscience and find out what they value and what they believe individually. Now, how do we do that? We do that because what gathers us, unlike other communities of like this, is that it's not a belief that makes us members of All Souls, but it's the promise that we make to each other, our covenant. So, in fact, if you would help me, if you don't know it, it's written in your program. Let's just say the words of the covenant one more time. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. So that is the promise. If you will agree to do your best to live into that promise with this group of people, you're welcome here, regardless of your belief or disbelief, your questions or your doubts. And the other meaning of the word promise is that we have promise. We are people of promise. We have possibility. So one of the things, we think is, that person is going to be a great mother someday, or father someday, or leader someday. So promise has both of these meanings. We make promises and we have promise. And so what I'd like to invite the children who are here in this service to do is, in just a second, to bring your flowers forward and help us to begin to make by putting your flower on this table here, to help us begin to make our circle of promises. Talk about promise. Those young people are so full of promise, full of our promises. And so the other thing is that we as a community make promises. From the beginning in 1921, when this congregation formed here in Tulsa, this congregation has taken the name and the mission as a spiritual home for all souls, a place for all people. So it is a commitment to love our neighbors as ourselves, whoever they are. It's a promise that's enshrined in the heart of this congregation. It's a promise enshrined in the center of the flame of our chalice. And it is a promise that we continue to make as a community. Now, the next move in this ritual is promises kept. One of the great things about making promises is being able to keep those promises. And we keep many of our promises. And I want to remind you that a few weeks ago, we had 12 of our most delightful 9th and 10th graders come forward and read their credo, their statement of belief, from this pulpit here. Now, if you know anything about our services when children are dedicated as babies or as children here in this community, we use these words. We say these words to the family who is dedicating, to the child and to the family during the dedication ceremony. We say, "We the people of All Souls, understanding our solemn obligation to share in the upbringing of these beloved children, we hereby pledge ourselves to promote their welfare in mind, body, and spirit to the end that they may grow in beauty, in love, and in truth." So that is our promise that we make to the families and the children of this church. And so We also ask the parents to remember when the child reaches the age of discretion, when they're able to understand what we just promised in their name for them, that we lead them to come forward to acknowledge that promise from out of their own hearts. And that's what we did. We fulfilled that promise with those 12 children, with those 12 youth and their families. And I hope you can feel the resonance of that promise kept. And there are many promises that we keep as a community. We have our covenant of service to one another, to help one another. And our care teams, we have 9 different care teams that do everything from bringing people to appointments, visiting people in the hospital, sending cards, making phone calls. We even have a hospice choir that sings to people as they're dying on their deathbed. We have many ways that we care for one another in this community. It's a promise kept. We also have our community resource bank, which is our promise to serve the community by helping people with hunger. We literally give tons of food to people around this community to help them in their families throughout the year. We also have our Partners in Education, which helps to enhance the education of young people in our community. We have our Voting is Power, which helps to support our democracy. And I could go on and on. You know, we give away our collection plate every Sunday to others to support all kinds of great causes in our community. These are promises kept. We make the promise and we keep the promise. And so I'd like to invite you to think deeply about a promise that you've kept, a place where you've been faithful in your own life to a commitment that you've made. It may be your marriage vows. It may be a promise that you've made to a loved one or to a community or some other way. So think about a promise that you've kept. And as we listen to this next song, I invite you, if you're willing and able, to come forward and place your flag. Thank you. It's beautiful. Look at this beautiful circle of promises made, promises kept. You can see it up on the screen as well. And it's a beautiful thing to be able to make promises, to be able to make commitments. As James Luther Adams says, it's what makes us human, this commitments that we can make and commitments that we can keep. And then we have to be real that we also break things. We break promises, we break hearts, we break glasses and lives, we break things out of carelessness and cruelty. We break things that were never meant to break. We break things because we can't imagine another choice. We break things because we're clumsy. We break things because we're human. This America that Emerson called a poem is still for too many people a lament or a struggle. This Oklahoma, known once as Indian Territory, has at times been for Native Americans more terror than territory. This church that its forebears called All Souls has not always been faithful to all people as the name promises to be. One of our main founders, you may be familiar with Richard Lloyd Jones, who was the owner of the Tulsa Tribune newspaper many years ago, back in 1921. And he played a very significant role in the lead up to and the aftermath of the massacre of 1921 here in Tulsa. Many of you may know that there was a front page article in the Tulsa Tribune that kind of sparked the fury that turned into incredible destruction and death, one of the worst, if not the worst, in the history of this country. And our church never held Mr. Jones to account or asked him to make an accounting or to make any kind of ask for forgiveness or repair in any way. And for more than 80 years, this church never called out his actions or the actions of the massacre at all, just never mentioned it. We, for 8 decades, were part of the conspiracy of silence across this community that didn't talk about it and didn't do anything to redress or repair what had happened. So in that way, this church has broken its core promise with regard to loving all of our neighbors as ourselves and being a church for all souls. And so today, I want to publicly, and I want us to publicly and ritually acknowledge and take responsibility for that broken promise. Because if we don't own it, if we don't name it, if we don't remember it, it continues to weigh on us and the community, and we can't even move to repair it. So we all have broken promises at different times. We have hurt others by our actions or by our inactions. So at this time, I want to invite some of our youth to come forward who are helping us with handing out if they're still here, some of our youth to come forward. And I would like to ask them to take some of the flowers from our circle to represent the promises that each of us and that all souls have broken or have witnessed. Could the youth come forward? Can you all come forward and help us? I want you all to take some of these flowers away to represent some of the brokenness, broken promises, and the broken promise of what could have been. We live in tangled lives in a big world that is powered by love and broken by supremacy systems, ideas of supremacy, superiority, one group over the other. And every day we participate in harm without even knowing that we are yielding to breaking a promise. So now I'm going to ask Randy to remove a few more flowers to represent the harms that we have caused, the breaks that we have made for promises without even knowing it, without even being aware. So breaking our covenants, sometimes it's unavoidable. Breaking our faith with life is real. It happens. Precious things are destroyed, even when we deeply regret their destruction. Relationships are broken, even when we regret their brokenness, even when we feel it's unavoidable. But promises we make, sometimes we break. And precious things are broken too. Part of the work of being human beings is sitting before the broken circle, acknowledging it fully, and refusing to turn away. It's countercultural in our culture to sit before the broken circle, to acknowledge it, to admit it's been broken, and to hold it. It's heavy work, so people don't like to do it, and yet we feel that it's one of the ways that we can be true and honest to ourselves and free ourselves from some of the burden of the reality of the breaks and the brokenness in our lives and in our community. You've been given a stone if you're here, and maybe you have something heavy you could hold if you're not in the sanctuary this morning but are with us. And you're asked to hold that as you sit with your grief before this broken circle. Feel the weight of the promises broken in our lives, in your life. As a senior minister, I'm going to especially be sitting with the collective grief and the confession of this congregation's historic breach of faithfulness around the events of 1921. And I hope that others may join me in that lament. And for those who identify as African American or Native American or any other group that identifies with something where you've received some kind of negative impact from some of the ways that All Souls has broken faithfulness in the past, I invite you to sit with the grief and the heaviness of the lost promise of Greenwood and what it could have been, what it could be right now. The lost promise of the Indian nations and all that they stood for and stand for and meant and were about. There has been immense promise lost through broken treaties and broken laws and the broken circle of the human family. And so while we sit in this brokenness, remember it's real, it's true. And know that there's been a lot of talk recently about collective trauma in cultures and anywhere where there's been violence and it gets passed down from generation to generation. There's certainly been, in all of our histories, some violence, whether you came from the incredibly violent European story and made your way here, or where families had come here through slavery, the Native people's trail of tears. There's lots of ways that everybody has either, you or your family members have experienced violence or witnessed violence or even potentially perpetrated violence. And that creates a sort of collective trauma in the psyche of a community. And one of the ways, and individuals, and one of the beautiful things about trauma that makes it different from, say, bodily injury, like if you get a hole in your head with a bullet, you can't repair that hole. But if you get a hole in your psyche because of trauma, that hole is actually repairable. And the way that we can repair trauma, one of the ways that they found that is powerful to repair trauma, especially collective trauma, is through rituals and music. And so today we offer both as a way of beginning to heal some of the collective trauma in our lives and in our community. James Baldwin famously wrote, and I think of 1921 Tulsa, I think of Gaza and Israel, I think of people all over the world across time and space. James Baldwin famously said, "Every bombed village is my hometown." Poet Nikita Gill adds, "And every dead child is my child. And every grieving mother is my mother. And every crying father is my father. And every home turned to rubble is the home I grew up in. Every brother carrying the remains of his brother across borders is my brother. And every sister waiting for a sister who will never come home is my sister. And every one of these people are ours, just like we are theirs. We belong to them, and they belong to us. Let us sit in grief and in sorrow now together for all that has been lost. Feel the heaviness of the stone in your hand as we sit together before the broken circle, before the brokenness in our world and in our lives." I can feel the heaviness, and I'm reminded that the circle can never be the same again. The relationships can never be the same again. The lives that have been lost, the relationships that have been broken, they can't ever go back exactly to how they were. And we have to hold the solidity and the heaviness of that in our hearts. Poet Rashini Ray writes, well, before I read that, I just want to say that, I've found, one of the things that I've found as a minister over these last 25 years is that our wounds can also be wombs out of which new life is born. Our wounds can be wombs, and out of our wounds can come gifts. And the poet Rashani Ray writes, "There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief, which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerge strength. There is a hollow space too vast for words through which we pass with each loss that we endure, out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into our very being. There is a clear cry, deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart as we break open to the place inside us which is unbreakable, which is always whole, and where we learn to sing again." I scuba dive, and there's a thing where when you go scuba diving, where you go down past where the light comes through, and you go down through the dark, and there's a point where you go down even further, and all of a sudden you can see again. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about going down through the darkness to the point where all of a sudden we can see again. That's a powerful place to get in touch with, because our lives are full of brokenness, but when we know that there's a light even through the depths of it all. So there's a promise in you that abides beyond your failures and your foibles. There is a possibility that you can still make real, and you can do it right now. There are commitments to which we must rededicate our lives. The final step in this ritual is the promise of renewal. Together we can turn back again and again to the love that is unshatterable. And to it, we can rededicate our lives. And through it, we can rededicate our lives. So we must be clear that there is no returning to before the shattering. There is no pathway back to the circle before it was broken. Nothing will be the same. But repair is still within reach. With our rededication, we can make the circle whole once more. So I invite you to take a moment to make a promise to life, to your family, to our community, to yourself, to our city. If you're believing God, to your God, about how you will move forward now in the work of repair in your life. Take a moment as you hold your stone in your hand and fill it with your renewed promise. Behold this circle of promise. Promise made, promises kept, promises broken, and promises renewed. Behold this circle that we make and remake again, which we break and repair, and know that that is the promise of being human. We are the promise-making creatures. We make promises and we keep our promises. We break our promises and we have the power to renew our promises. Let us give thanks for that this day and feel the power and the potential of this ritual in our hearts and in our bones.